my rabbi. Is that
Yep.
right?
Yep.
There we go.
Good afternoon, everybody. Oh, my word. Good afternoon, everybody. Oh, here we go. We're getting there. The Jesus I know. We looked at last week the Jesus I know as my Redeemer. That was Lauren talking about 3 points. We had the initial one, the woman at the well, where we looked at Jesus who empowered a woman who was basically in shame by her community. It was a community that didn't accept her, that didn't love her, but actually Jesus empowered her. He gave her power. Somebody who's, number one, a woman. Number two, who was rejected by society. We knew that because she came to draw water at the well at midday. Nobody would have done that unless you were rejected. Jesus also was compassionate. We looked at that in the context of the woman who caught in the act of adultery. In some translations, it translates that bit as caught in the very act of adultery. How they did that, I don't know. But they did. And they caught, and Jesus was compassionate towards that woman. Jesus showed that he had knowledge of the law, and this idea that he drew in the sand because it was a Sunday. He drew in the sand. It wasn't words that would have stayed. Therefore, it wasn't work. So he showed understanding of the law. He knew the law, and he challenged them. He showed compassion to the woman caught in adultery. And finally, we looked at Jesus as worthy of passionate praise. A woman who, when the disciples were eating, she came to him, she broke the perfume bottle on his feet and dried them with her hair, something that was just abhorrent in open society. But this woman showed Jesus to be someone to be worshipped. And the power that comes from a testimony, not just 2,000 years ago, but today, where the Messiah shows women such empowerment, such compassion, and such worth in today's society, where still, tragically, that sometimes isn't the case. And so the Jesus I know, my Redeemer, was last week. They were all from John's Gospel. This week we are going to look at the Jesus I know as my Rabbi. Rabbi is a Jewish word for someone to follow, someone to learn from. 85% of the Bible written in Hebrew and comes from a Jewish context. And that is why I'm choosing to call Jesus I know as my Rabbi today. So if you turn with me to Matthew's Gospel, we are on page 968. If you grab one that is around, that would be fantastic. Matthew chapter 4, beginning to read at verse 18. As Jesus was walking beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon, called Peter, and his brother Andrew. They were casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. "Come, follow me," Jesus said, "and I will send you out to fish for people." At once they left their nets and followed him. Going on from there, he saw two brothers, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John. They were in a boat with their father Zebedee, preparing their nets. Jesus called them, and immediately they left their boat and their father and followed him. The rabbi calling his disciples. We could have a very simple reading of that passage. We could look at it and go, okay, Jesus calls his first disciples. He calls us now. That works differently for people here. You might think, well, crumbs, I've got a nudge here today. I feel called to be a vicar. And you come, you'd be mad, and I'd try and convince you were mad if you came to me to say that. And if you worked beyond that, you would then probably be ordained. And you'd go for training, and that would be amazing, and that might be a a specific call for you. Another way we could look at this today is to think, well, actually, not everybody's thankfully called to be a vicar, but some people are called to follow Jesus in the setting of where they work and where they live. And we might do some ministry time and challenge people to think, how can I respond to that specific call for where I live, in the street I live in the flat I live in, or how can I work better and follow Jesus in the work where I live, as a mum, as a teacher, as a doctor, as a lawyer, as a banker, whatever it is. How do I do it? And we could do some ministry time, and that would be amazing, and that would be a very simple reading of that passage. But what I want to do is put a structure around this reading today where we can actually dig a little bit deeper. And that first simple reading isn't wrong. It's great. It's fantastic. Don't get me wrong. Absolutely brilliant. And if you come up to me afterwards and say, I think I want to be a vicar, we'll deal with that, and that'll be brilliant. But what I'm going to try and do is put a bit of structure around this, a bit of history that then empowers us to look at it and go, oh, there's something more going on here. Okay, part of it, it's a bit like, now, the thing is, I've got permission to say this before you go running up to Nicky afterwards saying, oh, he's been taking the mickey out of you again. I have got permission to use this. In our house, we have 3 different types of TV programs or films that we watch. The first type of TV program we watch is one that I like. And the ones that I like involve car chases, shooting, fires, people being saved. It's all very kind of butch. And things like Chicago Fire is great. I love it. It's firemen and firewomen running into burning buildings. Absolutely brilliant. There's not a massive storyline. You just turn your brain off. Absolutely superb. The reality is, Nicky just sits there and reads a Kindle. Oh, yeah, great. Then we have the TV programs we can both agree on, and we occasionally sit down and watch. If you like this type of thing, we like Madam Secretary. Absolutely brilliant. And the one that's on later on tonight, Line of Duty. Oh, did you watch it last week? Very exciting. You didn't watch it? No spoilers, no. Oh, no, because last week there was one big one. That would be great, wouldn't it? Just telling everybody, announcing, and they're dead. No, they're not. Thank you. And so we both watch these, and we're trying to get into the habit of what, if it's on a side with adverts on, we get in the habit of watching it a day later so you can fast forward through the adverts because you can't wait. And then the third option of things to watch is things that Nicky likes to watch. And the thing is, Nicky's latest thing that we will sit down together and watch is Portrait Artist of the Year. Seriously, you are watching paint dry, okay? The thing is, I don't have a Kindle. I don't like reading on a Kindle, but I like to share in the experience that my wife watches this program. And unhelpfully, for the first few weeks we were watching this, I used to say things like, I can do that. That's rubbish. That doesn't look like them at all. What are they doing? That's a poor... Oh, come on. They won. That's rubbish. And Nicky sits there going, can you shut up? Can you shut up? But the thing is, I've now got used to it, and I know what things to look for. And one of the things they were doing, especially last week, there was a guy, I can't remember who they were painting, and he starts, and he's basically just got brown. Okay, and he starts with brown and kind of dark brown, slightly lighter brown, slightly lighter brown, and he just starts painting this face in this multiple shades of brown. And you start to think, that looks a little bit like, that's brilliant. But then the next thing is he gets a different colour and adds in another colour and another colour. And I'm like, why didn't he start with black or red? Why brown? And Nicky kind of tuts and rolls her eyes and goes, because you put layers on top of layers and brown won't show through other layers. So now I'm informed on these things. But this is what we're doing with this passage. We're taking layers upon layers. We're starting with a simple reading, then putting another colour on top, another colour on top, another colour on top, until we get this breadth, this picture that we can all see and understand as what God and what Jesus was doing, calling his disciples. And the thing is, Jesus was raised in a Jewish society 2,000 years ago, and he would have done a Jewish education system. Now, seriously, this will blow your mind, that actually, at the age of 5, a little Jewish boy and girl would have done an education system called Bet Sefer. Okay? Now, the thing is, Bet is house. So, interesting enough, if you put Bethlehem, it's house of bread. So, interesting enough, Bethlehem, house of bread. There we go, there's an extra for you. But Bet Sefer is the first 5 or 6 years worth of education for a young Jewish boy and girl. And what they used to do at this education thing, they used to do 5 days a week, start at the age of 5 or 6. And if you just look at your Bibles and find the end of Deuteronomy, right? By the time they've done 5 or 6 years of Bet Sefer, so that would have made them 9 or 10, something like that, they would have memorized that. Okay, can you imagine anybody at the age of 5 memorize? To be honest, I walk into a room and I forget what I've come in for. And at the age of 5 or 6, Jewish boys and girls would memorize all of that. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, all memorized. That's just frighteningly exciting. Okay, and the interesting thing is what they used to do. What they used to do at the end of that, they used to get to the kind of age of 10 or 11, something like that, and then at the end of that, they used to kind of all the ones that had done really well and could just memorize and pull verses out left, right, and center. They were kind of creamed off. And they went on to the next set of education, which we're going to look at in a minute. But actually, the ones that got to the end and there we go, that's enough. You've done well, but, you're not the sharpest knife in the box. You go back to your families and learn the family trade. So fishermen, you go and do fishing. Carpenter, etc., etc., etc. And then at that point, as well, all the girls used to go home and learn their kind of looking after the family type trade. All right? The best of those used to go on to the next set of education, which was Bet, again, house. Bet Talmud, house of discussion. And this was the next level. This was just boys, and this was the best of that first batch. Between the ages of 10 and 14, alongside having just learnt the first 5 books of the Bible, they then had to learn the rest of it by rote, okay? So that's 80% of our Bible they learnt off by heart, all right? Now that's frightening. That's age at 10 they used to start doing that. They learnt the whole of what we call the Old Testament. Let's just flick, as a footnote to that, let's look at Luke chapter 2. On page 1028. Around about the age of 12, all the boys who got to the second level, the kind of championship of Jewish education, used to get sent for the bar mitzvah. This was in Jerusalem. They went up to the synagogue and at that point, 12 or 13, they were acknowledged as you are an adult at this point. And if we just look at page 1028, Jesus, the boy Jesus at the temple, initially let's just read verse 42, just half of it, and just say, when he was 12 years old. So at this point, Jesus will pretty much know the whole of the Old Testament. And let's just fast forward a few verses to verse 46. After 3 days, they found him in the temple courts, sitting with the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. Everyone who heard him was amazed at his understanding and his answers. By this point, Jesus was an adult, knowing the whole of that by rote. That was the Bet Talmud. And finally, when you'd reached that point, you went on to the Bet Midrash. And at this point, you've got the championship, the kind of just short of the premiership. They'd come through the basic education system, they'd done the championship, and then they creamed the best of the best off the top of that, and the rest of them, well done, sent home. You've done really, really well, but you're not the best of the best. But then they went into what the Bet Midrash, the house of story. And this was where you got selected by a rabbi to follow them and to learn what they thought about the verses in the whole of the Old Testament. They learned how to teach. They learned how to follow. They learned how to interpret Scripture, which was known as taking on their yoke, their teaching. And they followed their rabbi. Interestingly, again, another footnote. If you just look on the following page to Luke chapter 3, verse 23. Now, Jesus himself was about 30 years old when he began his ministry. Links in with what we're learning about here today, because actually no rabbi, or no disciple who's following a rabbi is worth listening to until the age of 30. Which kind of answers the question, why did Jesus wait all that time to start his ministry at the age of 30? Because in that culture, they just wouldn't have listened to him. In this, they would have. By the age of 30, he started his ministry. The best of the best. That was what he was about. That was what he was. But the interesting thing is, the disciples he called back in the Matthew passage, they weren't the best of the best. They weren't part of the Bet Midrash, the Bet Talmud. They weren't part of that. They'd done the basics, but they'd probably flunked out maybe once, twice before. They'd learnt the basics, the first 5 books of our Old Testament, but they were doing the family trade. They were working, conservative estimates put them at mid-teenage years, working in a family business, fishing. Fishing, a family business that done the basics, but Jesus was calling them. Jesus turned to them. Come, follow me, Jesus said, and I will send you out to fish for people. At once, they left their nets and followed him. Being called, even though by their Jewish education system, they'd not failed, but they just weren't the best. They weren't the best of the students, but Jesus called them. They weren't the ones that were the high-flying executives, but Jesus called them. They weren't the ones that were actually running the business because the dad was there running the business. They were like hired help, learning what to do, but Jesus called them. And the wonderful thing is, if we take the slightly bigger picture here, did they succeed in what they did? Did they, following their rabbi, did they do really well? And at the risk I had to shorten this, thought we could look through at the times that the disciples got it wrong. And they got it wrong plenty of times. Children fighting around Jesus, climbing on him. Tell them to go away. This is Jesus. Don't climb on Jesus. But tell the little children to come on to me. They got it wrong. Have we got anything to eat? Well, we've got 2 fishes, some bread, but nobody's doing anything with that, is there? Jesus prayed over it and provided for thousands. They got it wrong. They'd done the basic training. They were trying to do a family trade. We find out later on in the Gospels they couldn't even do that. When they went back to the fishing, they'd been fishing all night and caught nothing. They couldn't even go back to what the family trade was. But Jesus still calls them. Jesus chooses the failures and the high flyers. He calls us all despite our insecurities. He calls us. Despite our lives and our failures, he calls us. Despite our hang-ups and the things that drive us mad in our minds, he calls us. Despite our weight problems, I've been losing weight, thank you for noticing. Despite our weight problems, he still calls us. Despite our negativity going round in our heads, maybe about ourselves, about others, he calls us. Despite our frustrations of what we could do or could be in the future, he calls us. Despite our neurosis, he calls us. How do I know that? Because he called these fishermen, these failures in the Jewish education system. He calls them and he made them pillars of the church. Did they do a perfect job? No. But he made them pillars of the church. He calls us in our securities, in our insecurities, in the relationships we've messed up. He calls us. In the insecurities of our job, he calls us. Jesus, I know as my Rabbi. In one of Lois Tverbo's books, she talks about a blessing that was around at those times, of a blessing to disciples. And it goes something along lines of, may you be covered in the dust of the rabbi you follow. This idea that you follow so closely that the dust kicks up from the feet and hits you in the face, in the sweat, and it sticks to the sweat of the forehead and gets in your hair and on your clothes. May you follow that rabbi closely. So today as we finish, may you be covered in the dust of the Rabbi, Jesus. Despite what we think, despite where we think we may be, despite our failures, despite our frustrations, may you be covered in the dust of the Rabbi, Jesus, this Easter.